So what do you need to know already before we start today? Well, first off, you need to be able to define the word empire. And I get it because empire is one of those kind of funny words where it's like, we all understand it. If I say empire, in your mind, you have a picture of what an empire looks like. But when you try to nail down a specific definition, it gets a lot tougher and just gets, everyone kind of has their own thoughts and definition of it. But there's a couple of aspects of empires that you have to understand. First off, and this is simple, but it's important, it has to be like geographically large. It's got to cover a large area of land. Now, I say large, there's not a specific number of square miles. When you say, oh, well, that government has reached that many square miles, it is now an empire. There's not a number like that. It's kind of one of those, you know it when you see it type of things. But the other extremely important part of an empire is that it has to have multiple languages or cultures or religions inside its borders. If you have a governing area where everyone shares the same religion, culture, and language, that's just not an empire, okay? So when we talk about issues that empires are facing that we're going to look at today, a lot of them come up from the fact that you have people speaking multiple languages, practicing multiple religions, different cultures, etc. So we'll look into that. Also, you should be pretty familiar with contextualization at this point and how to write that for an essay. If you're not, if you're still a little confused, that's okay, because I'm going to help you out a little bit today. Also, by the end of today, if you're still a little confused on contextualization, go back and watch the video I did, was it last week or the week before? It's the one that's 9.6 to 9.7. And if you look on the side here, you can see all the videos that we've done so far. But the 9.6 and 9.7 one, I do a deep dive on contextualization. And I think that'll really help if you're still confused by it. Don't watch it right now because we're doing, this one. I want y'all to stay here right now. But when we're done, if you're still feeling confused, go watch that one. All right, so let's talk about our warm-up. Before we get into what we're talking about today, Mr. Smith gave you all some homework last night. You had two passages. One was from Marco Polo, the very famous Italian explorer who traveled throughout Asia, wrote a lot about it, became very famous in Europe. And you also had a passage from Ibn Battuta, who a Muslim traveler who also traveled many Muslim lands and reported back on it as well. And he asked y'all to identify some similarities in how the two men describe places they visited. So a couple of things you can mention here. In both of these writings, and by the way, if you haven't seen these yet, they are in the Google Drive that we've set up. If you look down below me and it says, access more resources, you might need to press see more there. You can see those. In both cases, though, they talk about the spread of Islam. Because remember, Islam as a religion starts in the Arabian Peninsula, but very quickly spreads to North Africa, through the Middle East, into South Asia, and as we're going to see today, even into Southeastern Europe in some cases. And as it spreads, both men talk about how the religious practices change as it spreads. I don't want to get into this too much because Smith is actually going to cover a lot of this tomorrow and look at some different versions of Islam that we see, especially in South Asia. But we know that's one of those kind of general laws of world history, that religions are going to change over time and as they spread over space. And we can see that in both of the readings there, and Smith will go into more detail with that tomorrow. Also, you see in both passages that both men point out that women, a lot of these areas where Islam is spread to, have a fair amount of independence. I'm not saying that there was complete gender equality in these areas, because there certainly was not. But you still do get a couple of glimpses of women having a lot more independence than we kind of traditionally think of women in the history having. So make sure you go back. If you didn't get to read those carefully, if you didn't notice those similarities, make sure you go back and take a look at those. All right, so let's start a warm-up question for today. I said we're going to talk about the expansion of empires from 1450 to 1750. And we're going to start kind of in the 1450 to 1500 time period. So here's my question for y'all. Why is it that we see empires expanding, especially in Asia, around 1450? So if you would, take a second. I'm going to give you 1 minute. I want y'all to write down as many ideas as you can brainstorm, possible answers of why is it that during this time period specifically, we see empires expanding. Because listen, we've seen empires expand all through history, right? But why in this time period specifically are empires expanding? All right, so you got 1 minute starting now. All right, you got about 30 seconds. If you can get 3 or 4 really good, solid reasons down, you're good. Just make sure, again, they are specific to this time period. Don't put something general like emperors want more land or something like that. Be specific. All right, 10 seconds. Pac-Man is closing his mouth. Oh, he's not Pac-Man, or he's upside down. I don't know what this is. All right, time is up. So let's look at some possible answers that you could have put. All right, possible answers. First off, the Mongols are pretty much kind of gone at this point. I talked about the Mongols on Tuesday. So again, if you weren't able to watch that, make sure you go back and listen to that video. Not right now, later on. But remember, the Mongols create an empire that takes over a large chunk of Asia. And now that they're gone, well, there's a power vacuum there. Somebody has to take over. And so we start to see empires expanding and filling up that power vacuum. Also, this is a time period where we're starting to see gunpowder being used as a weapon in firearms. Remember, gunpowder has been something that's been around for a long time, back in ancient China. But now militaries are starting to figure out how to use it to create a small explosion that will fire a projectile, whether it be a cannon or later on with rifles. And obviously that's going to be a huge advantage to empire building. If you have an army and you have firearms and the other side doesn't, well, that obviously puts you at a pretty big advantage. Also, consider naval technology as well. We're in a time now where ships are getting bigger, they're getting faster, we have better compasses, things like that. So people are getting around on the water a lot easier and quicker as well. Now, like I said, we're not going to really get into that stuff today. We're going to save that for next week when we talk about the Columbian Exchange and the creation of Spanish and Portuguese empires in the Americas, and then later in the Indian Ocean. But we'll get to all that next week. But notice something here. If you came up with 3 or 4 good, solid reasons why empires expanded in this time period that were specific, you just did contextualization. If I gave you an essay right now talking about, I don't know, the Ottoman Empire or something like that, you could use some of this as contextualization. Now, you need to be careful because as we talked about earlier with contextualization, it has to be specific to the topic of the prompt and to the argument you're making. So for example, if you're going to write about the Ottoman Empire, or if the essay is about the Ottoman Empire, you wouldn't want to talk about naval technology because the Ottoman Empire is more of a land-based empire. On the flip side, if the prompt is about European empires now in the Americas, well, I wouldn't mention the Mongols because the Mongols don't have a really big impact on what's going on in the Americas. So you need to be careful, but one way to think about contextualization is kind of start brainstorming what's going on in the world at the time, and then what's specifically impacting the topic of the prompt that I'm writing about. All right, so what do you need to know about these land empires? All right, well, first off, you have to be able to identify them and know where they are. The College Board wants you to know 5 empires in Asia and Afro-Eurasia in this time period. So you need to know about the Ottomans and the Safavids and the Mughals. And by the way, that is the Mughal Empire. Last night I was finishing up these notes and my son asked me a question and I said, I'm talking about the Mughal Empire today. And he's in middle school. He got all excited. He's like, wait, weren't those the people that like went around Asia killing everybody and destroying all the cities? Because, you know, he's a middle school boy and he loves death and destruction because that's what they do. And I said, no, I think you're thinking of the Mongols, not the Mughals. And he just went, oh. And then my other son, who's in elementary school, looked over at us and said, why are y'all talking about Harry Potter? And I looked at him and said, we're not talking about Harry Potter. And then I realized, oh, he thinks we're saying the Mughals. So just so we're all clear, everyone knows that the Mughal Empire, Muslim empire that took over India, the Mongols, they were the nomadic empire from Central Asia, or nomadic group from Central Asia that expanded into a large Asian empire. The Mughals, those are people that don't practice magic, that are not wizards, but they are not real. So we're not going to cover them today. Make sure you've got all that clear before we go on. Okay. Oftentimes the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires are known as the gunpowder empires collectively. That is a term that a lot of teachers, and you probably have been familiar with it, have heard about that this year. I typically don't like to talk about them together as the gunpowder empires. I don't use that term in my own class for a couple of reasons, mainly because if you just focus on gunpowder and military, you miss out on a lot of the other things that you need to know about these empires, that they are cultural and religious centers around the world. Also, they're not the only ones using gunpowder during this time, right? We know that there are European militaries that are also using that and harnessing that power. So I use that term because I know a lot of you are familiar with it, but if you don't know about the gunpowder empires, don't worry about it. But you do need to know the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals. You need to know that they are all Muslim empires, although we'll talk in a second about the differences between them. You also need to know about the 2 major Chinese dynasties in this period from 1450 to 1750. You've got the Ming dynasty that takes over China after the fall of the Mongols. Remember, the Mongols had set up the Yuan dynasty. They're gone. The Ming dynasty has replaced it. Later on, it gets replaced by the Qing dynasty, sometimes referred to as the Manchus because they come from the area of Manchuria, which is just north of China. So sometimes you might see on a test or in some readings something about a Manchu dynasty. They're referring there to the Qing dynasty. Okay, as far as like what you need to know about them, make sure first off that you recognize them. That if on the AP test you see something about the Safavids, you go, oh yeah, Muslim Empire, Persia, 1450 to 1750 time period. Make sure you recognize each of them. You don't need to know like every ruler that ruled them. You don't need to know exact places where they were. Just kind of know the general outlines of where they're located. But then we also need to talk about kind of how they expanded and how they kept control of these large populations over large areas. So let's first talk about how did they expand. And the number one way is simply guns, okay? I talked already about the importance of gunpowder and the creation of cannons and firearms and things like that. But again, if you've got firearms and the other army doesn't, that's going to help expand your empire. You're going to win a lot of battles. For example, this picture right here is a rendition of a very famous battle. It's called the Battle of Panipat. Panipat was a town in northern India that the Mughals took over as they conquered South Asia. Now, looking at this picture, there's a lot of detail in there. I know some of it's hard to try and figure out, but you should notice that in the middle of it is a bunch of smoke from cannons and firearms that were being used. Also, as these empires are expanding, they are using the talents of the groups that are conquering. Remember, the Mongols were very famous for this and were very adept at it. And these other empires are doing the same thing. If you had a certain talent, talent that helped the empire, then they were going to use you to do that. So on the one hand, they're using the talents of the people that they're conquering, but they're also having to appease them and keep them happy as well. One of the things that emperors always worry about is, of course, internal revolts, as we'll see here in a second. And then they also are able to control all the major trade routes. Going back to our map here, notice these empires are lined up right along the major parts of the Silk Road. They border the Indian Ocean and all the trade routes that are there. The Ottomans are kind of on the outskirts of the Sahara Desert trade and the growing trade in the Mediterranean as well. Well, if you control the trade routes, as we've talked about before, you can tax all the goods that are going back and forth across your routes. That means more money for the government. That, of course, means more power. You can buy more weapons and continue to expand your territory. All right, so how do they keep control of it? Okay, it's one thing to take the territory, conquer people, win battles and all that, but then how do you keep control over time? And actually, if you notice here, a lot of it's very similar techniques, okay? For example, I told y'all, recruitment of elites, people that are experts in different fields, that can govern, that can lead militaries. If you think about with firearms, you need to have a very well-structured government bureaucracy. You need to keep recordings of everything that you have. You need to keep records of it. And if you're going to create firearms and cannons, well, you need engineers to come up with designs. You need blacksmiths to create the actual cannons. You need accountants to make sure you've got enough cannonballs and bullets and all that. So again, you take the talents of the people that you've conquered and use them to help build up that bureaucracy of the government. One example of this in the Ottoman Empire is a policy known as devshirme. And if you're not familiar with this, inside the Ottoman Empire, especially as they expanded into the southeastern parts of Europe, you have a large population of Christians and Jews in that area. So there were times when the Ottoman army would go into a village that was predominantly Christian, and they would round up all the young boys in this village, sometimes ages like 9, 10, 11, 12. And they would look for the ones that are the most talented, the smartest, the strongest, etc. And they would take those kids from the village, bring them back to the capital, educate them, train them in the military. And a lot of times these kids would rise up the ranks and end up becoming very important members of the Sultan's court or very important leaders in the military or in the government bureaucracy, which meant for these kids, if you think about it, a lot of money, a lot of power, a lot of prestige. So it's kind of this weird situation when you think about it, because on the one hand, you're kidnapping your family, and obviously that's a really terrible thing, right? But it's also one of the few ways that kids in these villages could make their way up the economic and social ladder. Because as we've talked about before, through most of history, especially including this time, if your dad was a poor farmer in Southeastern Europe, then you're probably going to end up being a poor farmer in Southeastern Europe. But if you were recruited by the army and taken, that could lead to possible, again, power, money, prestige, etc. So the really weird part of this is that obviously parents didn't want their kids taken away, but there were some that were in some ways okay with it because they realized the possibilities for their kids. Now, by the way, can I just say a quick aside here as a parent, just give you a little bit of advice. Once you're done watching this video, you're going to walk out of your room. Your parents are going to ask, hey, how's the video? What'd you learn? And please, by all means, share with them what you learned today. That is important. But if you start talking about devshirme, don't ask them if they would want you to be taken by the army or if they would fight to keep you. Because if you ask them and they answer, you're going to be mad at them either way. Because either they're going to say, oh, no, we'd fight to keep you, and you get mad because that would keep you from a life of wealth and power. Or they're going to say, yes, we want a better life for you. We would definitely send you with the army, in which case you'll get mad at them and tell them that, they don't love you and all that. I don't want any fights in your house tonight, okay? You guys spend a lot of time with people in your house right now, so keep everything civil. Don't ask them what they would do because you don't want to know the answer, okay? Just kind of let sleeping dogs lie on that one. Okay, also, tax collection. I mentioned already, you have to have an efficient bureaucracy if you're going to rule over a large area. If the emperor is going to put out some sort of edict or law, everyone in the area has to know about it. Remember, this is obviously in a time before mass communication. You can't just watch it on TV or read it in the newspaper. So you have to have government offices all through the empire. You got to keep records of everything. Going back also, we were talking about taxes a second ago. If you're going to tax everything that comes through on your trade routes, well, you have to know what's coming through on your trade routes. Also remember, this is the time period when emperors in the Ming Dynasty were forcing Chinese citizens to pay their taxes in silver, and creates a big demand for silver in East Asia that eventually is going to lead to a global silver trade starting in South America and traveling all the way to East Asia. But we'll get into all that next week. But then again, the thing you have to consider with empires and trying to control the people in an empire, as we said already, by definition, an empire is going to have multiple cultures, religions, languages within their border. And sometimes that can be hard to keep control. Remember, if everybody had the same religious beliefs, it's easy to keep control. The emperor gets up there and says, hey, God or the gods told me that they want this for the country, so we're all going to do it. And everyone says, yeah, we agree because we all have the same religious beliefs. But if you don't all have the same religious beliefs, it gets a lot tougher for the government. So governments also use monumental architecture. We have seen this so many times in history. Emperors and kings spending insane amounts of money to build giant palaces and temples to show off their power. And it works. Remember, the ancient Egyptian pharaohs were building pyramids to show off their power. And it works in this time period as well. The Mughal emperors are responsible for building the Taj Mahal in India. Or if you think about Louis XIV and some of these other monarchs of Europe, like building the Palace of Versailles. Again, monumental architecture shows off your power. Now, I've talked a little bit about religion through here, but religion really kind of is a central part in empires trying to gain power and then keep it. Because again, if you're an emperor over an area with a large population with diverse religious beliefs, what do you do about religious toleration? Do you allow everyone to kind of continue their same religious traditions and ceremonies? Do you crack down on that? Do you force the people of your area to convert to your religion? It's something that emperors have to deal with. So in the Mughal Empire, for example, remember again, we're talking about a Muslim empire that is taking over South Asia, which of course is predominantly Hindu. So the Muslim minority group has taken over the Hindu majority. Emperor Akbar is probably the most famous of the Mughal emperors. There's a picture of him on the right, meeting with some Jesuit missionaries from Europe, where the Jesuits were that Catholic group that were really big on spreading Catholicism. But Akbar took the route of religious toleration, of like, look, Muslims are a minority in this country, Hindus are majority. We need to keep Hindu people on our side, so allowed them to continue with their celebrations and festivals. Because again, the one thing emperors worry about is revolutions inside their borders. And Akbar knew that if you want to keep people happy, allow them to keep their religious beliefs. Now, that was under Akbar. Later on in Mughal history, we have another emperor, Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb took pretty much the opposite route. Aurangzeb was very staunchly Muslim and felt as if the people of India not necessarily needed to convert. He wasn't looking for a mass conversion of everyone in India turn Muslim. But he did start passing laws based on Islamic morality. So ban certain types of music, dancing, drinking, things like that. And you see the people of South Asia starting to turn on the Mughal emperor. Now, I'm not saying that there was a big revolt. It wasn't like the Mughals were overthrown by the people of India. But jumping ahead a little bit, remember the British are about to show up in India. When the British show up, they notice that the people of South Asia are really not super loyal to the Mughals, because Aurangzeb's reign ends just as the British are appearing on the scene. And so it's easier for the British then to take over because the people of South Asia are not that loyal to the Mughal leaders. Or also think about the Ottoman Empire, especially as it expands into Europe. The Ottomans expand into the Anatolia Peninsula, which is today Turkey. A lot of people there convert to Islam, especially after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. But as the Ottomans continue to expand into the Balkans and Southeastern Europe, you don't really see mass conversions of Christians and Jews. Most of them still remain Christians and Jews. But the Ottoman Empire begins to allow them to continue worshiping as they want. Didn't have very strict laws on Christians and Jews. In fact, Christians and Jews were not treated equally as Muslims in the Ottoman Empire, but did have a lot of, pretty important rights there in the Ottoman Empire. And so when it comes to conversion of the conquered people, you see some. Again, there were some in the Anatolia Peninsula who converted to Islam, but it's not like we see in the Americas. Remember, and we'll talk about this next week, when the Spanish and Portuguese, later the British and French arrive in the Americas, you see mass forced conversions of Native Americans. You don't really see that as these empires are expanding in Asia. There are some, and there are some people who converted to Islam to help kind of move up the social or economic ladder, but not the mass types of conversions you'd expect to see. But you also do see religion playing a major role in conflict between empires. Remember I said a second ago, if you think about the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals, they're all Muslim empires. So you would think that they would all be cool with each other and be allies, but that's really not the case, because the Ottoman Empire was the main Sunni empire in the world, and the Safavids were the main Shia Muslim empire in the world. Now, if you remember, the split between Sunnis and Shias in Islam begins pretty early on in Islamic history. After the death of Muhammad, the question becomes who's going to take over the Islamic faith? Who's going to be the leader of all Muslims? And the thing is, by this point in history, there isn't like a leader of all Muslims. That's just not a thing. Like in the Catholic Church, you have the Pope, and everybody knows the Pope is in charge of all Catholics. But there's not a position like that for Muslims. So this issue over who should be the successor to Muhammad that Sunnis and Shias started fighting over late in the 600s, well, it's not an issue anymore. It's a moot point. But here's what you got to remember about religious conflicts. It's not always about the religious beliefs. It's about identity. If I start to think of myself as one religious identity and you're a different religious identity, well, then we are different. And then that is going to cause conflict, because that's caused conflict throughout the world. So tomorrow, Smith is going to talk about the Protestant Reformation and the conflicts between Catholics and Protestants in Europe. And he's also going to talk about this Sunni Shia split as well. So I don't want to get too far into it. But when identities develop, that's when the conflict occurs. For Shias, their identity, they see themselves as the minority group in Islam. And through most of history, they have been. These days, if you look at Muslims around the world, around, give or take, 80% of Muslims are Sunni and about 20%, give or take, are Shia. And Shias have always seen themselves as the oppressed minority group. And again, that continues on until today. If you're trying to understand issues in the modern Middle East, you have to understand the Sunni Shia split through history. Because these days, Iran is still mainly Shia, Saudi Arabia is mainly Sunni, and that's led to a lot of conflict between the two countries.